Professor Joseph Kahn, who is a presidential professor of education policy and politics at University of California, Riverside, to talk on it's obviously a very important and topical topic, preparing youth for democracy in the digital age. Professor Kahn is a graduate of Wesleyan and Stanford universities. He's taught at a number of distinguished institutions around the country. He's the author of many articles on this topic and others. He just had an incredibly engaging session with our students on a whole range of issues related to educational policy, and we're very pleased to have him here to talk with us about this topic. Professor Kahn.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I think I'm... Good afternoon, everybody. It is great to be here. It was really wonderful to have a chance to talk with the students engaged in this program already, and hopefully we can, go into more depth now in any ways that are relevant, but I'm also excited to have other folks in the room who might be interested in this topic, and so thank you so much for the opportunity. As was said, my main focus of my research and the school reform work I do and my teaching at Riverside is on preparing young people for civic and political life and the role that educational organizations can often play in that. So it's both looking at what are the factors that structure young people's engagement overall, but especially with a focus on the ways youth organizations, and perhaps in my work particularly schools, relate to that. And that's what I'll talk about. Given that we're sort of in Sacramento and sort of in the heart of it right here, which is pretty, cool, I'm going to focus a bit on trying to think about, so what would policy look like? How could we do that? And I hope when we get to the discussion, we can focus more on that. But being an academic, I perhaps should apologize. Initially, what I'm going to go through is some of the background and some of the ideas that set the stage for what I see as the imperative of highlighting this educational agenda. So I'll say a little bit about that to start. So we start with an idea that I think is fairly well established, that, but maybe isn't something that people thought about as much in previous eras, that democracy is precarious, that it's not inevitable. If we take a look at the 20th century, we see a century in which in many respects around the world, and I think one could argue within the United States, the degree to which the norms and values and institutional practices changed, they changed in the direction of supporting democracy. Not universally, but on average or in total, I think you could argue that the 20th century was a pretty good century in many respects for democracy. But it's not immediately obvious that that will be true of the 21st century. In other words, it's not immediately obvious that, whatever it would be, 82 years from now, if we look back, we would say, yes, in terms of the ways we think about democracy today, and perhaps we'll think about it differently then, we're living overall in a more democratic space than we were. Now, democracy is always a work in progress, but progress is not inevitable. I want to really highlight because, sort of depending on where, which part of the country you're in, you could have thought the biggest assault on democracy was during Obama, or you could think it was during Trump. But I want to really highlight and argue that this is much more a long-term trend than it is a moment. Or at least it's both a long-term trend and a moment. Didn't start with Trump or Obama. And the current things that capture a lot of our attention, being able to judge news and to deal productively with partisanship, those are both important things, but we need to be thinking more broadly than that. We can't limit ourselves there. So, for example, trust in government peaked in 1964, which actually is the year I was born. So it's been all downhill ever since I entered the world, and I hope that's not, that it's correlational but not causal, I hope. But But for the last 20 years, it's mostly been below 30%. So our confidence in government or the lack of confidence in government is not a new thing. And it's not just about government. Trust in public schools has dropped basically in half from 1975 to the present. Trust in the medical system has dropped by more than half. So what this is telling us is these are trends. And I think that's really important when we think about what are we going to do. We can't just respond to the moment when what we've been seeing has been happening over decades. Let me say a little more about this. If you take a look at a question that they've asked on surveys for a long time, but I believe this survey was given in 2011, and it asked people born in different decades whether or not they agree that it's essential to live in a country that's governed democratically, and this is U.S. population. People born in the 30s were a little over 50%. People born in the 50s hit the high at about 58%, and people born in the 80s are way lower. So we're seeing a generational shift in just the way in which people think about how important it is to live in a democracy. If we take a look at this question, sort of the flip side, having a democratic political system is a bad or very bad way to run the country. Again, you see the same thing. People who are older, far fewer of them tend to agree. The number who agree basically double if we're talking to 16 to 24-year-olds. Again, any of you who are in that age range, I don't hold you personally responsible. But we see that roughly, and perhaps you're right, maybe it is a bad way to run the country, but roughly twice as many people who are 16 to 24 agree with that question as who are 65 plus. But it's also relevant to note that when the same question was asked in 1995, you had the same trend, but everything was at a lower level. So everybody has become more likely to say democracy is a bad way to run the country. Every age group. Okay. Lower and middle class respondents support for authoritarianism. The question was, it would be good or very good to have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections. Again, this is not looking at age cohorts. This is just looking at the time. But in 1995, it was increasing to 2000, and it looks like it sort of leveled off and dropped a bit. But it's still much higher than it was in 95. But here's the more interesting part. For upper income respondents, they started far lower in 1995. Used to be far less likely to say that, and now they're actually more likely to say that. So these trends tell us something about a broad shift in attitudes towards living in a democracy, and a shift that has been going on for decades. I'd have to look that up. My guess would, I don't know, my guess would be that we're probably talking about the top 20%. But that's a guess. All of these stats come from a very interesting article by Foa and Monk that was published in the Journal of Democracy. And if anybody is interested and wants to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to have an answer for that kind of question. But I think in general what we're seeing is profound. Okay. Given that this problem is more a problem of a trend than an individual moment or an individual election, I think we have to look at fundamentals. And I'm going to argue that schools are one of the institutions, not the only institution, not necessarily the best institution. Every institution has limits on what it can do. But I want to argue that schools are one of the institutions that can help us provide the kind of fundamental response that we need to provide if we're going to address these trends. And if we're going to try, as I would argue, and I'm not going to argue here unless people want to, just in terms of time, that democracy is a good thing and is a good way to run the country, which is not to say it doesn't have challenges. But if we want to address that and we want to have our democracy operate more effectively, we have to start thinking about some of the ways institutions can help us respond. So, here's some more evidence that can help us think about this. in terms of understanding trends, and this is looking at young people, 18 to 24-year-olds. This is from 2012 in the current population survey, but these numbers are roughly comparable if we were to look at them today. You have big inequality when it comes to participation, and it's relatively low. So even when we're talking about voting in a presidential election, and we're talking about the group that's most likely to vote, those who have been to college, we're still only at about 50%. But when we start looking at folks that don't have a high school degree, it's less than half. And those trends hold for volunteering, or those patterns hold for volunteering, and they hold for a wide range of things, like working on a political campaign, working on a community issue. You can look at any number of questions that are on the current population survey, and you'll find similar disparities and inequality. So what does that add up to? Well, here's a table that I took from a report from PPIC, which I imagine many of you are familiar with. It's a Public Policy Institute of California that does a good bit of research related to public policy issues in California. And you'll see, again, some of these kinds of inequality in the way they show up. So this is looking at voting. And this table is a little confusing, perhaps. These columns roughly add up to 100, right? So we're talking about, of the total population, how many folks identify as white, Latino, Asian, Americans, or African Americans. And you'll see this is the case for the voting age population. But if you take a look at likely voters, you see that while whites are only about 43% of the total population, they comprise 61% of the vote. So again, you see some massive inequality. And if you take a look, these are unregistered voters who have citizenship status, so could be registered. I should be clear. And you'll see that the Latinx population is far more likely to be unregistered. And there are tons of reasons for this, but it also is a way of understanding where we get varied forms of inequality with respect to the degree to which the government responds to the needs of all people equally. On a national scale, I'm going to share quickly, and soon my sort of depressing tour through statistics will end. I'm going to share quickly a national study that looked at voter influence in the U.S. Senate. And there are a bunch of reasons why, from a methodological standpoint, the Senate is a good place to look. We actually have good statewide data of the way voters of differing incomes feel about hot-button issues. So they looked here at 6 hot-button issues: taxes, defense spending, abortion, a range of issues. And they ran regressions to examine how much did the opinions of upper-income voters versus middle-income versus lower-income voters align with the way the senators voted, right? So and they did it over about a 10-year period, so they had lots of votes that they could look at, lots of data points, so they could assess to what degree does income and the opinions of people's income shape the way their U.S. senators voted. And they found, and this isn't a surprise, that those in the top third of the income distribution, their opinions aligned very well with the way their U.S. senators voted. Now, there's some more blue states and more red states. It doesn't mean, right, there are upper income voters who are quite, on the progressive side in some states and not in other states. Their senators aligned with their views. For the middle third, there was some relationship, but it was dramatically less. In other words, the strength of the relationship between the opinions of folks in the middle third and the way their senators voted was dramatically less than for those in the top third, but there was still a relationship. There was no statistically significant relationship between the views of people in the bottom third of the income distribution and the way their U.S. senators voted. Once you added in the preferences of these two groups, this group had no impact that they could find statistically on the way their senators voted. And so again, this is the kind of thing that builds up when multiple factors lead to some groups of people having less political voice. You end up in a situation where their opinions don't end up predicting how their senators will vote. I'm going to just want to highlight, because there are a range of kinds of issues as we think about the dynamics at play in politics. I want to just highlight some survey items around issues of race. So this is a very recent, this poll was released after Charlottesville. 31% of individuals in national representative surveys strongly or somewhat agreed that America must protect and preserve its white European heritage. And 39% agreed that white people are currently under attack. Now, there are also a good number of people in the survey who would say other groups are under attack in this country, right? But what we're seeing is that as a country, there's a lot going on with respect to race in terms of how we want to think about how well our democracy is functioning and the ways in which different groups of people are going to experience the exact same events. Fake news was shared more than real news during the last 3 months before the election. This was the BuzzFeed study that I suspect many of you are familiar with. I'm just going to highlight the top 4 stories by circulation. These were literally the top 4 stories circulated through social media. And I think particularly important in an educational sense, if we think about young people, social media is now the #1 single source for news for those under 18. Right? So our openness to these dynamics, which again had something to do with the Russians, but that's not the only thing going on here, is obviously an issue that we need to be thinking about, not just for young people, but for all people. 23% of adults said they shared fabricated political stories themselves, sometimes by mistakes and sometimes intentionally. And we should know these are the people who said they did, right? We can assume that many people did because they still believe the stuff that they shared that was factually inaccurate. So again, we have a significant issue here. So now we're going to transition to something that's hopefully more hopeful. Studies find that individual judgments of the accuracy of posts are impacted far more. Oh, I'm not at the happy house stuff yet. I apologize. Far more by whether respondents agree with the post than by whether the post is accurate. Here's some partisan stuff that just shows, again, a long-term trend that we're becoming more partisan, and because we're becoming, well, I got to first do my little marriage slide. Then I'll do the issue. Okay, so you can tell I love surveys. So would it bother you, would you be unhappy if your child married a member of a different political party? They asked this question in 1960, and 4.5% of respondents said yes. They asked it in 2010. And I mean, I would pay for doing the national survey today just because it would be so interesting. Right, but again, it gives you a very clear sense of this growth of what partisanship means. And I should say it's the big change for those of you who are into the political science of this is not primarily that people are more partisan, but that political parties are far more aligned with partisan preferences. You used to have much more diversity of beliefs within political parties than you do today. So that now it's far less likely that you would have conservative Democrats or somewhat liberal or progressive Republicans. Those are far less likely than they used to be, and that's why you get this political party effect. So you have a confirmation bias when you have huge partisanship, and that is that you tend to seek out things that will confirm what you already believe. There's a prior attitude effect, which means if you already believe it or believe that the policy is correct, then you're much more likely to believe something said, whether it's true or not, that conforms with your prior attitude. And there's the disconfirmation bias, which is often the most interesting one to observe, which is to say if you already believe something strongly and you're given evidence that doesn't align with that, it's like they push a button and your brain goes into high gear and you become very smart at ways to undermine or critique the thing that you were just told, right? And tons of experiments document all of this. This can distort reasoning rather than evidence helping to shape judgments of policy positions or partisan beliefs. one's policy positions or partisan beliefs shape judgments of evidence and argument. So that what happens is we don't say, oh, I wonder what I should think about this. Let me look at a study. Instead, you say, I know what I think about this. Where's some evidence that backs that up? And one result is people don't just disagree about what to do, they disagree about basics. Makes it much harder for those of us who, in this kind of educational space here at the UC, are trying to argue that we want, evidence and argument and the strength of the evidence and argument to drive policy, when frequently once you have strong beliefs, that stuff gets pushed to the sidelines. Rational discourse suffers. Winning, not learning, becomes the goal. And you guys may have experienced this in classrooms too, where you'd have debates and the question would be, which side won? Not should they have won, right? Respect for others diminishes. Legitimacy of democracy. Right? So as you get really hyper-partisanship, people lose faith in the idea that, well, the decision came out of the democratic process, therefore it's legitimate, right? Because it's so much driven by partisan beliefs. And I think we see a lot of that today with partisanship becoming more extreme. Okay, now we're moving to the hopefully more hopeful part. Can evidence drive our response? And I'm going to say sort of. But I do think there's a bit of evidence we can draw on as we think about what we might do. But I wouldn't say we've done everything and we can prove this is the right stuff to do, but I would say there are ways in which we can make informed decisions. So here goes. We have solid evidence regarding several educational practices, and I'll say a little bit about those. Civic learning opportunities can help. This is a study we did in Chicago with 52 schools, 4,000 students, that we were able to follow over a 2-year period so we could watch how the impact of particular experiences influenced those same students, those same 4,000 students 2 years later. And these were things we looked at: discussion of current events, simulations, and these would be simulations of civic or political processes, focus on issues that students said they cared about, and exposure to service learning. And real quick, here's what we found. Now in the study, we controlled for things like the degree to which people were already civically committed, and our goal, our indicator is how committed are people to becoming civically engaged. People express more commitment than their actual level of engagement, but those who express commitment to become civically engaged are far more engaged, studies show, than those who don't, which isn't a surprise. So it's a pretty good indicator. So these are effect sizes, and what you'll see is, prior civic commitments, as you would expect, is a good predictor of how committed they are 2 years later. But so is whether kids are talking with their parents about issues, so is the degree to which they live in a neighborhood that seems responsive to issues in the community, and so is whether they have or express a sense of belonging to their school. All those things positively predict their level of civic commitment 2 years later. But here's the really good news. Exposure to service learning and classroom civic learning opportunities have a far larger effect. And so what this tells us, right, is that, sure, there are lots of things about where you're born, who your parents are, that will affect how engaged you're going to be. And parents' level of civic commitment or involvement is probably the best single predictor of how involved you'll be. But what this tells us is that if schools actively sought to make a difference, they could. And in fact, they could more than adjust for the differences that show up in families. Yes? So this was just a question on a survey that said, in the past year, have you been involved in a project in one of your classrooms where you worked on a community issue or to address a community problem? Okay. This is from 7 different districts in California that we did. And again, it was in partnership with a group called the Constitutional Rights Foundation, which is headquartered in LA. And I showed this slide. This is just to show the different practices that had an impact. And we looked at information and discussion, like did you have discussion of controversial issues where you got information about those issues? And here the experience model is things like service learning. Did you have experience working in a community organization? Did you do a service project? Things like that. And I highlight this slide to say different experiences have different effects. right? Not every civic learning experience has the same effect. We see that, not surprisingly perhaps, if you had discussion of current events, it promotes political interest. But if you worked on a service project, it doesn't necessarily promote political interest, and you wouldn't necessarily expect it to, because often those service projects don't highlight the political aspects of what kids are doing. But if you do a service project, your confidence in your civic skills, your interest in being engaged in voluntary activity, those things increase. Whereas if all you're doing in class is talking about controversial issues, your desire to volunteer doesn't increase. So I really want to highlight this to say what we need to give kids is a broad array of learning opportunities, because different learning opportunities will have different impacts. On media literacy, since it is such a hot issue at the moment, we have findings that students who reported 3 classes with media literacy learning opportunities were 26% more likely to be able to correctly distinguish between an accurate and an inaccurate post. And you know, we showed them 2 posts. It was an online survey, and just said, is this accurate? Here's the bad news. There are insufficient opportunities. So from that same survey of 19 districts in California, we see, and this data is now a little bit old, it's about 10 years old, but I don't see reasons to think that it would dramatically have changed. Many kids aren't getting these opportunities. Some more on inequitable access. This comes from a nationally representative study of high school students, and if you are, this is comparing the average socioeconomic status, 9th graders, and this is the class. Like we had evidence of their socioeconomic status for each kid in the class, and we averaged those, right, so that we knew what the average socioeconomic status was of kids in the class. And if that average was at the average, we called it an average class in terms of socioeconomic status. Now, there are some districts where, or some classrooms where you have mostly high socioeconomic status kids. And if that were the case, and we were looking here at the 2 standard deviations, no, we were looking here only actually at 1 standard deviation above the mean, would be a high, that moves, you know, that moves you to about the 83rd percentile in terms of socioeconomic. If you were in a class that was at that 1 standard deviation above the mean, right, roughly a class where the socioeconomic status was at the 83rd percentile, you were twice as likely to report having discussions of how laws are made. You were basically twice as likely to report participating in service activities, and you were almost 1.5 times more likely to report taking part in a debate or panel discussion. So we have a situation where, and we talked about this early on, there's a lot of inequality in terms of political power or political influence. Schools may be adding to that by giving those kids who are likely to have the most influence more of the opportunities. Okay, finally we're getting to what can we do? So building on some of those kinds of findings that say what we do in schools can matter, groups like the California Task Force on K-12 Civic Learning has been pushing for statewide initiatives to reform and add more to the civic learning opportunities that all kids in the state have. And here are some of the things that they're trying to promote and that I think the evidence is clear are worth trying to promote. We know pretty solidly from research that service leads to trust, to future engagement, and to a sense of efficacy. We know that well-facilitated discussion leads to understanding and to interest. And I want to say clearly well-facilitated discussion. Not every interaction between people leads to insight, right? Some of them may lead to students being interested, but they generate more heat than light. And we know that media literacy lessons can improve people's ability to judge the credibility of online content. There's other stuff, and I mentioned some of that before, but those are 3 of the big things that the California Task Force are focusing on and that I think there's really solid evidence are worth focusing on. So here is where we get to some of the problems. It's not obvious or easy to promote these goals. It's very hard to mandate what matters. And I'll show you in a moment a video of a classroom that I think is a pretty high-quality classroom, and I think it will surface why you can't just pass a law, say, do this, right? Because some teachers don't know how to do this, they don't have the curriculum to do this, and in some cases, the state and district policies aren't encouraging them to do it. So let's take a look at a brief, it's about a 5-minute video of an interesting class that engages people in what I think we would argue is a version of best practice. It's not the only way to do best, the only good thing to do, but it's one of the good things to do. It's an issue kids care about and can relate to, and it is simultaneously pushing for deeper understanding. Now you will test my deeper understanding because I have to exit this. Okay. Still have to exit it. Thank you. As you can see, I lack a certain deeper understanding. Oh. There we
go. As far as this lesson goes, and Common Core standards, I think one of the strongest aspects of this particular lesson addresses citing textual evidence. Today's topic is teen driving. It is a part of a larger picture, but they'll have to decide on their own whether or not we should increase the legal age for teen driving. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with a little bit of discussion about kind of what you think is age appropriate when you become responsible as a student.
Well, I think you can become responsible at any age because, for example, if you have your mind set on being responsible, you will be responsible.
So you're saying you think it's less of an age and it's more of a mindset?
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because you will be reading something about that in your text in a little bit. So these are all things I want you to think about. The next step, I present them with the text. They are required to go through the text and do what we call text marking. And I want you to mark what is a fact and what is an opinion. Facts are something that you, as a researcher, a scientist, a student, a human being, something that you can prove. I want them to understand when they're reading through informational text that oftentimes authors will present something that as a fact when it's not being backed up, and so I just want them to be able to differentiate. But really the goal behind any text marking is to focus them on the text. What I'm trying to get you to do is start to think about how you feel about this topic, and eventually you're going to back up your opinions with the things that you've read from these articles. All right, in these small groups on the note page provided, I want you to work together. What you're going to do is you're going to find and label the notes. And on the right-hand side, you have 4 different columns. It says money, maturity, behavior, education, or experience. You have to categorize those notes.
16-year-old drivers are involved in fatal crashes at a rate nearly 5 times the rate of drivers 20 or older. So it's probably maturity too, because they're talking about the age.
I really don't know. It's probably most likely between maturity, education, and behavior.
Maturity.
After they finish the directed note-taking, I have them get into larger groups, and this is where we start to move into the philosophical chairs aspect, which can also be done as a Socratic seminar or any other kind of discussion technique. Philosophical chairs always has some sort of side issue, all right? Remember, it is not a debate because we don't win. It is a discussion because we share our opinions. That's the difference between debate and discussion. It's called a jury-style philosophical chair. They were moved into groups of about 5. They elect a jury foreperson, and they're going to decide as a jury, after reading the text again and discussing it amongst the peers, where they fall on a basic question.
16-year-old drivers are involved in fatal crashes at a rate nearly 5 times the rate of adults, people 20 years or older. So 16, so at least 4 years of immaturity and reckless driving.
I still disagree because do you guys want to drive at 18 instead of 16?
Yes.
You'd rather wait 2 more years than you need to. What if you have a job?
It's like saying in paragraph 10 that they want to be like, oh, it's all teenagers, but it's actually, there's more people 20 to 49 years old who are killed because of alcohol poisoning than the teens are. So it's like, you can't exactly blame the entire teen population for that.
This is one of my favorite things about this lesson is how strong it is in this collaborative discussion. Even though I have them start out individually, the real meat of this lesson lies in the Common Core standard of collaborative discussion. Now is the time to use your challenge card. What I want you to do is, as a group, come up with one question for another jury that either clarifies or asks them to challenge their opinion.
When you were reading from paragraph 10, you only said half of what they had said, and it read only about 10% of the 16-year-old drivers killed in 2003 had blood alcohol concentrations of 0.10 or higher. But you didn't finish the sentence that says compared with 43% of 20 to 49-year-old drivers killed, according to the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety.
Dang! How do you respond? Your whole group can take part in that.
Okay, well, can you find a positive quote in this article that has to do with keeping the age 16?
One of the goals of Common Core is, once they get out of high school, will they be able to survive in college and in a career? Will they be able to discuss their ideas with their peers?
When you're starting at 16, since you don't have that much experience, you are risking more lives.
No, the article says that if you're going to start at 18, it's the same thing as starting at 16, because you're not going to be driving from that.
You gotta hang on for 1 second. Now, guys, the important part about this is not to win an argument. The important part is that you've gone to the text for facts, you've gone to the text to create your argument, and that's how you form an argumentative essay, which is what our goal is today anyway. I think Common Core is still a mystery to a lot of teachers, but in reality, it simplifies life. Every grade level is headed towards the same goal, and so while we do it differently in grade levels, or it's on a different plane, the direction that we're all headed in is the same. And so now that I have my head wrapped around Common Core, I actually enjoy it a lot more. I feel like it gives me more freedom with my curriculum.
From the beginning. Okay, I can click through. No. Sorry, we're going to just click back through. And I'll move. I want to save time for questions, so I will try to wrap up. Oops. Okay. So as I've said, and as we talked about actually in the discussion with the students earlier, what's challenging often is to figure out how, in Sacramento, or at a district level, can one promote policies that would actually lead to more of the kind of high-quality discussion that we just saw. And I think that what we just saw is the reason I want to show you is I do believe that is consistent with best practice, and I think it becomes sort of clear that it's not like a thing you could just mandate, like do that. The teacher who did that had a ton of skill, and over the course of a year had worked with students so that they were able to handle those roles in successful ways. I know what my high school classes were like, and I suspect for many of you, that was both an uncommon kind of experience, and if you had tried to do it the first time, it wouldn't have gone so smoothly, right? But it can work, and it can work with all kids. The most prominent state-level reform currently out there is one that is now requiring the citizenship test. It's pushed by the Joe Foss Institute, and I believe they're up to 14 different states, you'd have to count, that are requiring that all students pass the U.S. citizenship test prior to graduation. I don't know if any of you have become naturalized and had to take this test, but the test is 100 questions. You can look it up online. They're the same 100 questions, and they don't change it. You just have to memorize the answers. And it's particularly interesting because some people who are taking it right don't speak English or don't read English well enough to even understand. They have to memorize when it looks like that, this is the answer that I circle, because I know what those letters look like. One of where is the Statue of Liberties on the test currently? How many stars does the flag have? We elect a president for how many years? How many amendments? I won't embarrass people by asking if anyone knows how many amendments. I didn't know, but I looked it up. But the point is, and these aren't irrelevant things to know, but I guess I would argue that this is a very easy law to pass, passed in 14 states already. California has shown no interest in it. We appreciate that about the state. But this is a kind of thing that you can sell because it works as a soundbite. Shouldn't every high school student know what we require every, naturalizing citizen to know? But it isn't going to allow people to be more thoughtful. Here's some things that I think could help. Professional development and professional communities for teachers with educational resources where they can learn how to do these forms of best practice. Structural commitments and supports, and I'll say a little bit about those, developed with attention to what youth, parents, community, and teachers want. And meaningful ongoing measures of opportunities and outcomes. And I want to highlight this because I do think that if you want things to happen at scale, you have to actually attend to whether they're happening. And one of the places that we are thin right now when it comes to civics is that we don't actually measure whether kids are getting these learning opportunities, and in only very superficial ways do we measure whether kids are developing the capacities that we need. Here are some examples of structural commitments. So in Oakland, we worked with the district. We've now been there 6 years. They've changed their graduate profile from preparing all kids to be college and career ready to preparing all kids to be college, career, and community ready. And then a group of about 12 teachers worked over the course of a year to articulate what does it mean to be community ready, how would we know, what would we do. In other words, there are ways to start articulating these goals and to pursue them. A capstone project is another thing many districts have that can be tied to civic engagement and can be a very powerful opportunity structure for then schools to pursue. But it's important if you're preparing kids for a senior year capstone project that you don't begin that preparation second semester senior year. Rather, you think of how do we give kids experiences perhaps all the way from middle school on so that by the time they're trying to do a high quality project in their senior year, they've had chances to practice key components of that work. Service learning projects are another common structural way to promote this. A policy analysis requirement is something that some districts are using. And again, I just say a little bit about that bullet about what do we mean by attention to youth, parents, teachers, and community. Well, teachers define what being community ready means. Teachers create the rubric to figure out what the senior project should have in it. In other words, you want to involve the people who are most relevant to it in the creation of the guidelines. I wouldn't want to see that come from the state on down in too prescriptive a way. And then measurement, and this is from Tony Breik at the Carnegie Foundation. It's very hard to improve at scale what you can't measure. How do you try to make sure everybody's doing it if you never attend to whether everybody's doing it? I know I ran a little over, but I hope there's some time for questions, and thank you.